I raised my hand that night and I spoke those words loud enough for everyone to hear. If Jesus were truly alive, I said, let him answer me tonight. The room erupted. My family cheered, and I felt nothing but certainty. But at 3 in the morning, something knocked on my bedroom door, and when I opened it, no one was there. The hallway was empty, and the door behind me closed on its own. Could a man who spent his entire life fighting against something actually be running toward it? If you are watching this for the first time, consider subscribing. Stories like this one are why this channel exists, and there are more coming every week that you will not want to miss. Ibrahim Rahman had built his life the way a craftsman builds furniture, piece by piece, joint by joint, with intention and care. By the time he was 41, he stood at the center of a community that admired him the way people admire a lighthouse. He was steady. He was certain. He was a man who had an answer for every question. He had grown up in a household where faith was not discussed but demonstrated. His father prayed 5 times a day without fail. His mother recited verses while she cooked, and the rhythm of their home had been woven together by devotion. Ibrahim absorbed all of it, and then he went further. He studied, he read, he debated. He stood on platforms before hundreds of people and dismantled arguments the way a surgeon removes something unnecessary. He was particularly skilled at debates involving Christianity. It was not cruelty that drove him. It was, as he told himself, precision. The truth deserved to be defended with the sharpest tools available, and Ibrahim believed he had them all. His wife Hanan understood this about him. She was 38, soft-spoken in the way that still water is soft, and perceptive in the way that still water also reflects everything around it. She watched her husband with the kind of eyes that see more than they say. She had noticed over the past few months that Ibrahim was sleeping less, that he sometimes stood in the kitchen long after dinner had been cleared, staring at the wall. That when he came home from his lectures, there was something tight in his jaw that did not release the way it used to. She did not ask him about it directly. She knew Ibrahim well enough to know that certain doors had to be left open before he would walk through them. Their son Adam was 16 and wore his father's certainty like a jacket he had borrowed. He quoted Ibrahim's arguments at school. He had started correcting his teachers. There was a fire in him that made Ibrahim proud on the surface and uneasy underneath, though he could not have explained why. Their daughter Amina was 12 and noticed things the way children who read too much tend to do. She asked questions at dinner that landed in the middle of the table like stones dropped in still water. And then she watched the ripples. The gathering happened in late October, on a cool Saturday evening at Ibrahim's uncle's house. It was the kind of family event that filled every room, where cousins who had not seen each other in a year stood in doorways catching up, where plates of food were passed over shoulders, where children ran between the legs of adults. Ibrahim loved these evenings. They reminded him of who he was and where he came from. Someone had mentioned Christianity. Ibrahim could not even remember who, but the conversation had begun to drift, the way conversations at family gatherings do, from one topic to another, and someone had made a comment about a neighbor who had recently been sharing their Christian faith with people in the community. The comment was not hostile, it was merely curious, but Ibrahim had stepped in. He had not planned to speak, but the words came the way words always came to him in moments like these, organized and certain, building on each other like bricks. He talked about the historical inconsistencies he believed existed in the New Testament. He talked about what he described as the impossibility of the resurrection. He talked about how Jesus, whatever his role in history, could not be what Christians claimed him to be. The room had gone quiet to listen. And then, because he felt the attention, and perhaps because there was something inside him that night that wanted to prove something not to his family, but to himself he raised his hand and said it. If Jesus were truly alive, let him answer me tonight. The room erupted. His cousins laughed and nodded. His uncle clapped him on the shoulder. His son Adam, seated across the room, looked at his father with an expression that was somewhere between pride and reverence. Only Hanan did not react. She looked at her hands. Only Amina, seated near the window with a plate she had barely touched, looked at her father with something else in her eyes. Something that might have been worry. Ibrahim drove home that night, feeling the way he usually felt after a strong lecture. Elevated, confirmed. He said good night to his children, kissed Hanan on the cheek, and went to bed. He could not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark, and the words came back to him. If Jesus were truly alive, let him answer me tonight. He had said them to silence a conversation. He had said them to demonstrate a point. But lying there in the quiet, something about the way he had said them felt different than it had in the moment. Less like a statement, more like something else, a challenge. He turned onto his side. He thought about the lecture he had to prepare for Thursday. He thought about the paper he owed to a colleague at the university. He thought about anything that was not the feeling beginning to settle into his chest, which was not quite guilt and not quite fear, but something that existed in the space between them. At around 3:30, he heard the knock. 3 times, measured, like someone who knows they are expected. Ibrahim sat up in bed. Hanan was asleep beside him, undisturbed. He swung his legs over the side and walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle. He did not know what he expected to find. A child who had gotten up in the night, perhaps Adam or Amina. He opened the door. The hallway was empty, not just unoccupied, empty in a way that felt deliberate, like a room that has been specifically prepared. The lights in the hallway were off. The house was quiet. There was no one. He stood in the doorway for a moment. And then, behind him, the bedroom door closed. He did not touch it. He did not bump it. It closed. Ibrahim turned around slowly. The room looked exactly as it had. Hanan still asleep, the curtains still, his book on the nightstand, his phone face down beside it. He stood there for a long time. Then he got back into bed, pulled the blanket up, and told himself it had been the wind. He told himself the door had been improperly balanced. He told himself he had imagined the knock. He did not sleep again that night. By morning he had constructed a satisfying rational explanation for everything that had occurred. It took him approximately 2 hours to build it, and it held together reasonably well in daylight. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his explanation, and felt moderately confident in both. Amina sat down across from him with a bowl of cereal and looked at him. "Baba," she said, "did you sleep okay? You look tired?" "I slept fine," he said. She stirred her cereal and did not say anything else, but she kept looking at him with those eyes that saw too much. Over the next 2 weeks, Ibrahim did what Ibrahim had always done when something threatened his equilibrium. He worked harder. He gave 3 lectures in 10 days. He accepted a panel invitation he had previously declined. He went back through his notes on Christian theology and found every argument he had ever assembled and sharpened each one until it gleamed. He also, quietly, pulled his old copy of the New Testament from the shelf in his study where it had sat for years as a reference text. He told himself he was reading it to find new weaknesses. He read it with a red pen in hand, ready to underline inconsistencies. He did not underline as many as he expected. He told himself it was because he already knew the arguments by heart. He told himself the translation was poor. He set the book down several times and walked away from it and then came back. The Sermon on the Mount bothered him in a way he found difficult to categorize. The instructions were too specific, too practical, too internally consistent. He found himself reading a passage about loving one's enemies and then stopping, not because it was wrong, but because it reminded him of something he had observed. Her name was Ruth. Ruth lived 2 houses down from the Rahmans, and she was a Christian. Ibrahim had known her for 6 years and had spent most of those 6 years being politely uneasy around her, because she was the kind of person who made his arguments harder to sustain simply by existing. When Hanan had been sick the previous winter, Ruth had brought food to their door for 3 weeks without being asked and without making it into anything. When their car had broken down one morning, it had been Ruth who offered to drive Adam to school without blinking. When a family on their street had lost a child, Ruth had sat with the mother for hours. She never talked about her faith with Ibrahim. She never tried to debate him. She just did things. He had always found it easier to dismiss the arguments of Christians than to account for Christians like Ruth. He put the New Testament back on the shelf and went to prepare for Thursday's lecture. Thursday's lecture went well, by every external measure. Ibrahim spoke clearly. The audience responded. Afterward, a small group of his students gathered around him the way they always did, eager and bright-eyed, and one of them said, "Sir, that was your best one yet." Ibrahim smiled and thanked them. Driving home, he felt nothing, not the elevation he usually felt, not the satisfaction of a thing completed. Just the hollow quiet that follows when you have been performing for an audience you have stopped believing in. He stopped at a traffic light and sat there after it turned green long enough for the car behind him to honk. It was during the 3rd week that it happened. Ibrahim woke at 2 in the morning without knowing why. He lay still for a moment, and then he noticed the light. It was not the street light outside. The curtains were closed, and the room was familiar in its darkness. But there was something different about the air in the room, a quality of light that did not come from any identifiable source. Soft, still, present, the way warmth is present, the way you feel it before you see the fire. He sat up slowly. The man was standing near the window. He wore white clothing that Ibrahim could not have described accurately afterward, because his attention was not on the clothing. His attention was on the quality of presence the figure carried. Ibrahim had stood in front of large crowds. He had been in the company of respected scholars. He had met people who commanded attention simply by entering a room. This was nothing like any of that. There was no fear. This was the first thing Ibrahim noticed, and it surprised him, because he had expected fear. Instead, what he felt was the complete and total absence of the noise that had been living inside his chest for weeks. It was gone. The way a headache disappears and you realize only in its absence how constant it had been. The man looked at him, and in a voice that Ibrahim would spend years trying to describe to people who asked him and never be fully satisfied with any description, the man said, "Why do you fight so hard against the one you have been searching for?" Ibrahim opened his mouth. He had spent 20 years building arguments. He had answers for everything. He had anticipated every question, every challenge, every angle of approach. He had no answer for this. The light faded the way morning fades stars, slowly, and then all at once. And Ibrahim was sitting on the floor beside his bed with his back against the mattress, and he was crying in a way he had not cried since he was a child, from a place so deep inside himself that he had not known it was there. Hanan did not wake up. He sat on the floor until the crying stopped, and then he sat there a while longer. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning at the edges of the curtains. He got up, he made coffee, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house, and he did not build an explanation. He sat in the question. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of Ibrahim's life, and they were difficult in a way he had not been prepared for, because the difficulty was entirely internal. He gave more lectures. He said the same things he had always said. He watched himself say them from some distance inside himself and felt the gap widening between the man on the platform and the man in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. He smiled at his students. He accepted more speaking invitations. He told himself he needed more time. What he needed, though he could not yet say this, was courage. He reread the Gospels, all 4 of them. He did not read them with a red pen this time. He read them the way he had learned, years ago in graduate school, to read a primary historical source, which meant reading them with the assumption that the author intended to communicate something true. This was a discipline he applied to every other text he had ever studied. He had never applied it to these. What he found unsettled him. He found a coherence he had not granted himself permission to see before. He found a figure who said things that were either the words of a profoundly disturbed man or the words of someone who was exactly who he claimed to be, and nothing in between. He found descriptions of healing and restoration and encounter. He found people who had spoken to this figure and been changed in ways they could not reverse. He thought about the figure by his window. He thought about the question. He went back to his university office one afternoon and began going through old files. He had kept everything, physical copies of notes and papers going back to his graduate years. He found the folder he was looking for in the bottom drawer. It was labeled simply Historical Sources, and it contained notes from a research project he had begun 15 years ago and never completed. He spread the papers on his desk and read them. The evidence was all there. Historical corroboration for the existence of Jesus, the consistency of eyewitness accounts, the implausibility, from a purely historical standpoint, of the resurrection being fabricated given the immediate context of the 1st century. He had read this material 15 years ago and written 3 words at the top of the first page. Not conclusive. Stop. He stared at those words for a long time. He had stopped not because the evidence was weak. He could see that clearly now. He had stopped because the evidence was strong, and accepting it would have cost him his path, his career, his standing, his identity. He had been 26 years old and he had seen the road clearly, and he had chosen to look away. He sat in his office until the building went quiet and the custodian knocked on his door to tell him it was past closing time. The conference invitation came a week later. It was from the Regional Council of Islamic Scholars, a group whose regard Ibrahim had worked for years to earn. They wanted him to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference. The topic was to be a refutation of Christian missionary activity in their community. They were expecting his strongest work. He read the email 3 times. He read it again in the morning. He had not yet replied when he came home that afternoon and walked into the kitchen to find Hanan at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. It was not a question. He sat. She looked at him for a moment. "Ibrahim," she said, "I have been married to you for 17 years. I know what you look like when you are fine. You are not fine." He opened his mouth and then closed it. "I am not asking you to tell me everything," she said, "but I want you to know that I see you. Whatever is happening, I see you." He looked at his wife, at the woman who had stood beside him through everything, and he felt something crack open in his chest. Not painfully, more like a window being opened. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said. It was the truest thing he had said in months. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She did not say anything. She just left her hand there. He had 3 days before he needed to reply to the conference invitation. On the 2nd of those days, Adam came home from school in a mood that Ibrahim recognized because he had worn it himself at that age, sharp and ready, the mood of someone who has just won an argument and is still carrying the energy of it. He threw his bag down in the entryway and came into the kitchen, saying something about a Christian kid in his class who had been talking about his church and how Adam had told him exactly what he thought of that. And wasn't he right, Baba? Wasn't he absolutely right? Ibrahim looked at his son. He looked at the brightness in the boy's eyes, the pride, the certainty. He saw himself at 16. He saw himself at 26 writing, "Not conclusive, stop," on a page full of evidence he did not want to read. He saw himself at 40, standing before a room full of family and raising his hand and saying words that he had used as a weapon against a truth he was beginning to recognize. He looked at his son and he saw what he had been building. "Adam," he said. "What? What is this student's name?" Adam blinked. "Daniel. Why? What did you say to Daniel?" Adam started to answer and then seemed to register something in his father's tone. He slowed down. He repeated what he had said, less triumphantly this time. Ibrahim listened, and then he said, quietly, "I am going to ask you to apologize to him." The kitchen went very still. Adam stared at his father. "Why?" Ibrahim thought about how to answer. "Because," he said, "there is a difference between being certain and being right, and I have been confusing those two things for a very long time." Adam did not say anything, but something shifted in his face. Confusion, and underneath the confusion, the beginning of a question. On the morning of the third day, Ibrahim sat at his desk and he made his decision. He accepted the conference invitation. The conference was held in a large auditorium, 3,000 people, video screens, a professional sound system. Ibrahim had spoken in rooms like this many times and had always walked in feeling prepared and left feeling confirmed. He sat in the front row before the program began and looked at his notes, which were thorough and sharp and represented some of his strongest work. He folded them and put them in his jacket pocket. He was introduced by the council chairman, who said generous things about his record and his scholarship. The applause was long and warm. Ibrahim walked to the podium and looked out at the audience, at the rows of faces expecting him to say the things he had always said. He stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he spoke. "I want to begin by thanking this council for the honor of this invitation," he said, "and I want to begin by telling you that what I have to say tonight is not what you invited me to say." The room shifted, a subtle change in the quality of attention, like a change in air pressure before weather arrives. "I have spent the last 20 years of my life building arguments against Christianity," he said. "I have been very good at it. I have been praised for it. I have been given platforms because of it. And for most of those 20 years, I have told myself that my certainty was based on truth." He paused. "Several weeks ago, I was given a question, not by a debater, not by a scholar. I was given a question that I have not been able to answer. And in trying to answer it, I discovered something that I had buried 15 years ago on purpose." He described the notes. He described the historical evidence. He did not describe the encounter by the window in detail, because he did not have language that felt adequate. He said only that he had been given a question in the night that he could not dismiss, and that the question had led him back to evidence he had once chosen to ignore. "I have not become someone with all of the answers," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am at the beginning of something, not the end of it. But I can no longer stand in front of people and speak with a certainty I do not have." The silence in the room was not hostile. It was the silence of 3,000 people confronted with something they had not expected, which was the truth delivered without performance. "I taught you that questioning was weakness," he said. "I was wrong. I taught you that certainty was the same as integrity. It is not. It is sometimes the very thing that prevents integrity. He took the folded notes out of his jacket pocket and held them for a moment, and then he set them on the podium and stepped back from the microphone. He walked off the stage. What followed was not silence, and it was not chaos. It was something in between. Some people in the audience sat very still. Some people stood up. There was murmuring and then louder conversation. The council chairman came backstage with an expression that moved between shock and something that looked like it was trying to decide whether to be anger. Ibrahim shook his hand and thanked him for the invitation and walked out to the parking lot. He sat in his car for a long time. Then he drove home. There is a version of this story that would have Ibrahim's confession produce immediate results, a dramatic wave of conversions, a tearful reconciliation with his wife, a son who comes to him and says, "I understand now, Baba," a community that respects his honesty. Life, being more serious and more complicated and more kind than stories usually allow, gave him something different. His phone was full of messages before he reached home. Most of them he did not read. A few he did. The responses ranged from devastated to furious to something that might charitably be called concerned. He heard from colleagues and former students and members of his community who felt and said so plainly that he had betrayed them. He put his phone on the kitchen counter and he did not pick it up again that night. Hanan was waiting. She had watched the live stream of the conference on her laptop. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop closed in front of her. She looked up when he came in. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen you do," she said. He sat down across from her. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "I know," she said. "We will figure it out." She did not say she agreed with him. She did not say she was ready to follow him wherever his questions led. She said, "We will figure it out." And it was the most honest and most generous thing she could have said. And he understood that. The months that followed were the most humbling of Ibrahim's life and, unexpectedly, the most clarifying. He lost most of his speaking engagements. His position at the university became complicated in ways that required several long and painful conversations with his department head. He was invited to step back from his role in the community lecture series. People who had admired him publicly began to maintain a careful and respectful distance. He began meeting quietly, on Tuesday evenings, with a small group of people who were asking the same questions he was asking. Some of them were former Muslims. Some were people of no defined faith who were curious. There was a retired pastor named William who said very little and listened with a quality of attention that Ibrahim found more sustaining than any argument he had ever heard. There was a woman named Grace who had been asking questions for 30 years and was gentle about not yet having all the answers. He continued reading. Hanan came to one Tuesday evening and sat in the corner of the living room where the group met, and she listened without saying anything, and she came back the following week. Adam took longer. 3 weeks after the conference, Ibrahim came home to find that Adam had gone back to his school and asked to speak with Daniel during lunch. He had apologized. He had not made it dramatic, he told his father. He had just said that he had been wrong about some things, and he was sorry for how he had spoken. Daniel had said thank you and offered to share his lunch. Ibrahim listened to this story and did not say anything for a moment. "What made you decide to do it?" he asked. Adam looked at the table. "You said there is a difference between being certain and being right," he said, "and I kept thinking about it. Because I was really certain when I talked to him. But I don't think I was right." Ibrahim put his hand on his son's shoulder. One evening in February, Ibrahim was sitting at his desk when he received a message from a young man named Karim, who had been one of his students 3 years earlier. Karim wrote that he had watched the conference online. He wrote that he had spent the past several months angry about it, and then confused, and then finally searching. He wrote that he was not yet sure what he believed, but that he had begun reading the Gospels, not to argue against them, but to listen to them. He thanked Ibrahim for having the courage to be publicly uncertain. Ibrahim read the message twice. He did not feel like a man who had caused a wave of inspiration. He felt like a man who had stumbled in a direction that turned out to be slightly more honest than the direction he had come from, and who was still walking. He wrote back to Karim. He told him that he did not have a map, only a question that had been given to him that he could not dismiss, and that the question seemed to point towards something rather than away from it. He told him to keep searching. He closed the laptop and looked out his study window at the street. The February light was low and pale, and the trees were bare. Ruth, 2 houses down, was carrying groceries from her car to her front door. She made 2 trips. On the second trip, she saw him at the window and waved. He raised his hand. He sat for a while in the quiet. He thought about the figure by the window and the question that had been given to him. The one question that had dismantled 20 years of certainty and replaced them with something smaller and more honest, which was the beginning of understanding. He thought about how he had expected condemnation and received instead a question. How the question had not been an accusation, how it had been, in the deepest sense, an invitation. He had spent his life debating the claims of Jesus. He had never expected Jesus to show up and claim him. If there is something in this story that stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. And before you go, take a look at the videos waiting for you on your screen right now. Each one carries a story of faith tested, truth found, and lives changed from the inside out. Choose one and let it continue what this story began. We will see you in the next one.